looks like, for reasons that have been explained over and over again. I don't want to go into the reasons because we are looking for hope today. But I want to look at the reasons why we ended up with a bad deal in the first place. Because it is important that we understand the misunderstandings that we have about Cuba and about Cuba policy, so we don't make these mistakes again, since we're going to be negotiating with the Cubans for a number of years into the future. I believe what happened, what was announced on P17, happened by design and not by competence. It was intentional. I believe the president used the negotiations over the release of Alan Ross to get rid of a policy that he believed was the cost and not the consequence of what's happening in Cuba. He approached the negotiation handicapped by two incorrect assumptions. I call the first assumption hope in change. Is a copy of the moral of the president in 2008. This belief hopes that by changing traditional U.S. policies, things will get better. In the case of Cuba, and this is something that the president specifically said, he hopes that by changing the U.S. policy on Cuba, for example, the U.S. relations in Latin America will get better, and Latin American nations will join the U.S. side in putting pressure on the Cuban government to improve human rights. Those who know Latin America know that this is extremely unlikely. The second incorrect assumption I call the reaction policy. And this is possibly the most pervasive misunderstanding about Cuba, common among Cubans and non-Cubans alike. And I want to put a little emphasis on this because I think it's important to understand this now that we are talking to the Cubans on a regular basis. The reaction policy explains everything that happens in Cuba as a reaction to something the United States does. Some examples are common. For example, Fidel Castro decided to join the Soviet Union because the United States closed the door on him because of U.S. hostility. Or that Fidel Castro invaded Angola because he wanted to stop a normalization attempt by President Carter in the late 70s. Or, this is probably the most common one, that Fidel Castro shut down the Brothers to Rescue planes in 1996 because he wanted to stop yet another attempt at normalization by President Clinton. It's a simplistic way of looking at the way Cuba reacts, or the way Cuba acts, which is actually the way we should be looking at it. It ignores the roots of the problem between Cuba and the United States, and it ignores the realities on the ground. It ignores the nature of the regime and the reasons why the regime does what it does. This belief has been exploited by the Cuban government, who came up with their own theory about explaining their repressive nature. They say we are repressive because the United States is a hostile nation and wants regime change. And this belief is so pervasive that the president repeated some of these in his speech on the 17th, and I want to quote, "These sanctions, the policy, have had little effect beyond providing the Cuban government with a rationale for restrictions on its people." So the Cubans are bad because we are misbehaving. Another example from the same speech on the 17th, the president said, and I quote, "Our sanctions have denied Cubans access to technology." When everybody knows that the Cubans don't want average Cubans to have access to that technology, and that's the reason why they don't have it. The reaction policy always overestimates the power of U.S. engagement and always underestimates the ability of the Cuban leaders to make rational decisions as rational actors. And it ignores the true nature of the regime. It's a regime that is hyper-personalistic, that is dogmatic, that is ruthless, but is rational. They do the things that they do because they believe they're doing it for their own benefit. And they have always, inevitably, favored internal control over anything else, including the welfare of the Cuban people. In the end, the president approached the negotiation already convinced that the reason Cuba was broken was primarily because of U.S. policy, and that the best way to fix Cuba was to change U.S. policy. So he was ready to acquiesce to what the Cubans demanded, and so he did. But it's done. And now we are in a new environment of diminished U.S. leverage in Cuba. So we need to start thinking about how we are going to promote U.S. interest in this new environment. And U.S. interest is a peaceful transition to democracy in Cuba. So we need to come up in this new environment with ways to support the real agents of change in Cuba, or positive change in Cuba. Those agents are the Cuban dissidents. And I insist on this because too often defenders of engagement dismiss dissidents as irrelevant and see only the regime as the only agent of change in Cuba and the only partner of negotiation. And I'm not saying that this is what the administration is doing, but I'm saying that this is what many people who believe in engagement do. So we need the Cuban dissidents, we need to support the Cuban dissidents because they are the ones who will monitor the pace of any commitments that we make with the Cubans as part of this negotiation process. The dissidents are our canaries in the coal mine in Cuba. They are the ones who will keep the pressure on the regime to make meaningful political reforms, not just economic reforms. And their demands for political and civil rights should not be postponed to a better moment, to a better place. They should pressure, and they will pressure for these demands now, because, and I'm going to quote, paraphrase, Tania Rivera, who did something very, very brave in December of last year, challenged the Cuban government to show that they were willing to move after D-17. And Tania Rivera said that the right time to demand inalienable rights is always. Without open support for these dissidents, I fear that our new policy might fall into a form of agency capture syndrome. For those who are not familiar with it, and I want to read the concept, is agency capture occurs when a regulatory agency created to act in the public interest instead advances the special interest of the same industry it is charged with regulating at the expense of less influential groups, such as consumers. It is possible, very possible, that U.S. companies that are allowed to do business with Cuba will lobby the U.S. government to moderate its criticism of human rights violations in Cuba, so it won't disrupt their business with the Cuban government. Actually, such a lobby has already been created. It's called the U.S. Agricultural Coalition for Cuba, and it groups a number of companies that are interested in doing business with the Cuban government, including Cargill, which is probably the biggest company. So I sincerely hope that those who lobby so effectively to end the old policy, and many of them did it with the best intentions, will put the same passion and the same effort into supporting not just Cuban entrepreneurs, not just civil society as a whole, but primarily the dissidents, the individual men and women in Cuba who represent the best hopes for a truly free and prosperous